We begin with a CBC News exclusive. It involves one of the 4 suspects charged in the 2023 murder of BC Sikh leader Amandeep Singh. We've learned that when one of the alleged gunmen was arrested in Brampton, Ontario last year, that he was heavily armed and that he was detained just one day before a gathering in the city that brought together a who's who of the Indian government's list of Sikh enemies. Evan Dyer has the details.
This is one of the 4 people who would ultimately be accused of first-degree murder in the killing of Amandeep Singh, and he was charged finally this spring. But he actually was arrested, unlike the other 3, about 6 months before, on November 3rd in Brampton, and that was on a Friday before a weekend when there was a wedding in the city that brought together a sort of a who's who of the Sikh Khalistani referendum movement, which is the movement that the US and Canadian government believe has been targeted by the government of India. For example, Amandeep Singh killed in Surrey last June, which led the government of Canada to accuse India of that assassination, was the coordinator of the referendum effort there. One of the people who was originally threatened with him, who was warned by the RCMP with Nijjar, a man called Narendra Singh Bol. They were warned together. Nijjar was subsequently murdered. Narendra Bol sort of stepped into his shoes, leading that Gurdwara and referendum effort, has since been warned again by the RCMP that he's still a target for murder. He was a guest at this wedding in Brampton, and he arrived on the same evening that Amandeep Singh was arrested, along with 5 other men, all of whom are still in custody, none of whom have entered a plea on the firearms charges that they were held with. So what we have here is really just a juxtaposition of events that could be a coincidence, and we have no word from police to say that there was a plan to attack wedding guests. Certainly there are no charges relating to the wedding, but many of the guests who were at that wedding now, looking back with the knowledge of who Amandeep Singh was and how those arrests happened really just hours before guests began to arrive for the wedding, are connecting the dots and wondering if those 2 events might have some real connection.
Well, yeah, Evan, I mean, the wedding happening just the very next day, I mean, that's got to raise some questions and concerns.
Absolutely. I mean, there were already, of course, security concerns for many of the people who were invited. And actually, one of the guests who was invited and widely expected to attend canceled at the last minute. And this is Gurpatwant Singh Pannan, who lives in New York City and who already was the target of a murder conspiracy, according to U.S. authorities, who've issued an indictment that specifically identifies Indian government officials as having tried to kill Pannan in New York City. Pannan is really the worldwide leader of Sikhs for Justice and of this referendum effort that has annoyed the Indian government so much. And he also has, ever since that murder conspiracy was detected, he has a lot of security. And when he travels, therefore, there's a lot of issues. It's difficult for him to simply get on a plane. It has to be coordinated in advance. And for all of those reasons, he decided at the last minute not to go to this wedding. And he called the father of the groom, who's one of his oldest and closest friends, and told him, look, because I bring so many security issues and liabilities when I travel, I'm going to sit this one out. I wish you and your son the best, but I'm not going to come. But of course, his presence would have been expected. The date of the wedding and the fact that these guests would be expected to be there had been publicly announced earlier in the year at the Surrey Gurdwara where Nijjar was shot, because there had been a scheduling conflict with one of these referendums, and so they had to move the date of the wedding in a very public manner. So people would have known that these people would be expected to be at the wedding, and that some of them indeed were at the wedding. And that, of course, raises the question of whether they would have seen that as a target of opportunity, which we don't know for sure, but which the timing certainly is suggestive.
So, Evan, you have spoken to some of the guests who were at that wedding. What did they tell you?
Well, they told me that looking back now, that they feel that they may have, metaphorically and not so metaphorically, perhaps dodged a bullet. These are people who know that they're threatened by the government of India for a number of reasons. For one thing, the government of India continues to talk about this. For example, Prime Minister Modi, in the Indian election campaign, which just ended yesterday, I believe, has spoken on the campaign trail publicly about how his government has the courage to go into its enemies' houses and kill them there in their own home, which is generally understood to be a reference to this campaign of overseas assassinations. We've also seen the US and Canadian government both explicitly say that India is engaged in these activities. And of course, we've seen actual killing, the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and the issuance of a number of duty to warn letters to other people associated with that effort. So the people who were at that wedding, while they're relieved about how things have happened, both the arrest in Brampton that weekend and of course the arrests of the 4 men accused of being part of the Nijjar hit squad, they see those as positive developments, but they're not under the illusion that this ends the threat to them, because if the modus operandi that's been described by the US and Canadian governments continues to be used by India, which is to try to kill its enemies by hiring criminals basically as hitmen, there's an inexhaustible supply of such people. And the fact that one group of alleged hitmen have been arrested and are in custody doesn't mean in their minds that another group can't be found just as easily.
Evan Dyer in Ottawa, thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Now, our next guest attended that Brampton wedding that happened just a day after the suspect was arrested. Joining us now is Narendra Singh. He's a spokesperson for the BC Gurdwara Council and also a close friend and associate of Nijjar. We reached him in Surrey, BC tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we are, as you just heard, and as you already know, learning that one of the suspects, Amandeep Singh, was heavily armed in Brampton, is what we understand. He was detained just a day before that wedding that you attended. When you hear that, what's your reaction?
I think when we look back at it now, a lot of dots connect. At the time, we were hearing things almost weekly that people's lives could be in danger. Individuals like Mr. Gurpatwant Singh Pannu. We hadn't learned at that time when this wedding was taking place that the U.S. indictment came a couple of weeks after that. But people like that would be primary targets. Individuals like myself who have duty to warns would be targets, and a bunch of other Sikh leadership that was coming in from across the country there as well. So at the time, it didn't seem like anything was out of the ordinary. We did hear about this arrest while we were at the wedding. It was very kind of surprising and shocking that all these people are gathering. But even at that time, there wasn't any direct link. But now it seems extremely plausible, to say the least, that whether it was Mr. Pannu or whether it was anyone else from the Sikh leadership that was there, that it could have been a target that weekend because India was acting so brazenly and continues to do so.
I mean, of course, there are no charges that any of the 4 are facing related to that actual wedding. But talk to me about that moment at the party, at the wedding, when you hear that this arrest has happened just a day before you're all there in attendance. What does that feel like?
There was discussion there at the wedding as well among some of us that could this be something that's going on. There were a few individuals in the Gurdwara that they did have some people set up outside the parking lots just to be watchful of what was going on outside as well as people were inside. So there was a bit of a tense moment there at the wedding itself. But I think for us it was one of those things that we weren't overly sure of the connectivity to us or to this arrest and whether there was any. After the U.S. indictment and after this now charge laid on Amandeep Singh in Mr. Nijjar's murder, now those dots are starting to connect. So whether that comes out in the future, what we feel is that those dots connect because of the U.S. indictment and Mr. Pannu potentially being there and him being at the top of their list, along with 3 or 4 other Sikh Canadian leaders that would have been there as well at that particular wedding. So now it seems much more plausible than it did at that moment.
Yeah, it would have been just 5 months after Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot and killed. When it came to an invite to that wedding, knowing who would be all in attendance, knowing that the date was so public, did you yourself have any second thoughts about, is it a good idea to travel and to be in a situation like that? And I'm sorry to have to ask, what is it like to live with that kind of a concern over your shoulder all the time?
I think it's become a bit normalized, unfortunately, over the last year or so. But at the time, I really wanted to attend because I've known Mr. Kela since I was a child, and our families were very close. So I did want to attend. I did hear, we were hearing things weekly that, so-and-so might be at risk and so-and-so might be at risk. Sometimes you do worry about going to public places where you might put others at risk. And I think that's what Mr. Pannu did as well. He was looking at the entire congregation that was going to be there and the potential target that is on him. Individuals like myself have a similar type situation, and others as well within the Canadian Sikh community. So we're always wary of where we go and why we need to go. We make all of our efforts to make sure that that nobody else is at risk around us. But that's actually because of the Indian government, and that's what we want to make sure that gets out there, is that this is not how anyone wants to live their life. But we're not going to back away from our movement for Khalistan just at the risk of violence that the Indian government has now inflicted upon the Canadian Sikh community, that we will continue. And they should have no right to come to a place like Canada and kill a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil and not be held accountable for that in the international community.
So then that gets to my next question. What do you think needs to be done to make sure that people in your community feel protected outside of your own personal precautions that you are sort of forced to take at this point?
I think from a public safety kind of situation, an inquiry into India's involvement in foreign interference within Canada, solely focused on India, because India is the only foreign agent or actor that has actually killed a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil that we know of. So I think it actually makes sense to understand how deeply have they penetrated into Canada, how much they're actually undermining our democratic processes and elections and killing our citizens here on Canadian soil. That the only way we can actually do that is through a public inquiry. If we focus on 3, 4, 6, 8 shooters, they can send those this year, next year, 10 years from now, and that won't provide public safety. We need to know exactly what is going on here with India, have a public inquiry, get recommendations, and then make sure those recommendations are followed up on, so Canada as a sovereign nation and also the Sikh community that exists here is safe from this type of interference that India is inflicting.
Narendra Singh, a spokesperson for the BC Gurdwara Council and a close friend and associate of Nijjar, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.